big leader in this community and a voice for our community. I welcome my guest this evening, Maurice Ferre.
Thank you, Susana. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, Maurice, I have to tell you, you definitely are part of the fabric and the making and part of the author of this great city of Miami and all the turns that it's taken in the last few decades.
I was one of many. There were many, many people that, but I was the longest standing elected mayor of Miami in the history of Miami.
Well, that's what I wanted to tell, that, you know, Maurice Ferre, for everyone listening to the show, if you're not from Miami, since this is 880 The Biz and it's nationally syndicated and internationally through iHeart, Maurice Ferre was a 6-term elected mayor of Miami, and that was 12 years that you served this city.
Those elections were for 2-year terms. It's now changed to 4, but in my days, and before me, it was always a 2-year term.
Which has to be exhausting to every 2 years to campaign.
Full-time campaigning all the time.
Full-time campaigning.
Never stopped campaigning for 12 years.
Well, to meet you is to definitely meet a very elegant, good-looking, and absolutely eloquent in your communication. No one can say that with your communication skills beyond all, you know how to really bring together a divided city. And that is definitely known. Your wonderful speeches, your wonderful address to our city and to our state, you know, Miami, and to represent South Florida as an elected official has really, you created so many new programs, and you definitely saw one of the most controversial growth eras, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right.
From 1973 to 1985.
That's it.
What a decade plus.
Yeah.
That's an amazing decade. You actually came in with the Latin boom, where you saw the South Americans and how close the proximity of Florida has always been, right? But you also were part of all the controversy from the cocaine cowboys, the riots of McDuffie, also the Mariel boat lift.
Right. It all happened during my tenure as mayor.
And it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your doing.
I had nothing to do with it, but I was the mayor and I did the job.
You did the job. Now, let's go back before we start getting into the nuts and bolts of 73 to 85. And then, of course, the second part of the show, we're going to go to the now and present and the future, because you're doing some great things still and continue to do so. So we want to keep our audience aware of all the wonderful projects you're doing. But what brought you to Miami?
Well, first of all, and I'm not going to go to a long, recitation of all these things, but I was born in Puerto Rico in 1935. Puerto Rico was then an American territory, still is, that was ceded by Spain to the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. So my father was born in Puerto Rico. My mother was from New York. I was born in 1935. I grew up in Puerto Rico. Then my father was a great believer in good, stiff education, and so he packed me off when I was 12 years old, and I went to a prep school in New Jersey. After I graduated in 1953, I had been accepted at UPenn at the Wharton School. And my mother said, look, you've been away now for 6 years. Why don't you come home and spend a year? And my father and and the Ferré family had bought a very, very large multi-million-dollar corporation, which was the largest concrete and rock company in Florida at the time, and was on the American Stock Exchange. And the Ferré family was producing cement in Puerto Rico and shipping it first by bags and then in bulk to Port Everglades, and it became a very, very large business. And so I said, sure, there was a big exodus of Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico in 1940.
Well, a lot of people do not know that.
Yeah.
They always think of Miami as Cubans,
Yeah.
but the truth is that the first Latinos and one of the largest populations of Latinos were Puerto Ricans.
Well, large in quotes because in 1953, when I moved to Miami, the population of Miami was about 700,000 to 800,000, of which 2 to 3% were Hispanic. But in 1940, which was a decade earlier, there had been a mass exodus of wealthy Puerto Ricans who came here. And that's another long, complicated story. But Muñoz was elected in 1940, and the sugar barons and the wealthy, there was a wealthy class of Puerto Ricans that thought that Muñoz was going to be Fidel Castro. Obviously, different place, different time, but
Right.
they said Puerto Rico is going socialistic and it's going to become a socialist. So all these Republican senators and wealthy sugar barons and a lot of doctors and a lot of professionals moved from Puerto Rico to Miami.
To Brickell Avenue.
And
right?
they started buying all these mansions on Brickell Avenue. That was in the 40s. Now, my dad came along in the 50s because my dad, the Ferré family and the Roig family, related by marriage, had the idea of putting up a sugar mill in Central Florida, and that was going to be in Fellsmere, which is very close to Vero Beach, right off of Lake Okeechobee. That didn't work out, but my father saw this tremendous potential of Florida, and in 1952 purchased a large chunk of stock in Mall Industries, and with the right to purchase control in 54, which he did. And so I stayed at the University of Miami and graduated in 1957, got married, and lived here.
But I understand also that you wanted to pursue a career in art. You
Right.
loved architecture, and the University of Miami did not offer that
That's
curriculum.
correct. That's
and you
correct.
went to the University of Pennsylvania.
Nope, I never got there.
You never got there, but
Yeah,
you
yeah.
wanted to.
Yeah, because I decided when I stayed in Miami that I would study architectural engineering, which was what was available in architecture. And then after I finished, you're right, I loved Louis Kahn, who was the dean and the professor of the School of Architecture at UPenn. So I wanted to go get a master's degree at UPenn, but I never did that.
You know,
You
went to Central Florida to oversee Jose Ferre, which is your father.
Yeah.
The sugar plantation. No,
No,
not
no,
plantation.
no.
Sugar.
No, that never panned out. But Mall Industries was a company that started out in the concrete and rock business, and so my dad asked me to come work with him. And so after I graduated, I went to the University of Miami to get an MBA in finance. But I started working, and I never left. And by the time we sold the company in 1978, the company had about 2,000 employees, so it was a major employer.
And that was the concrete company and
rock and concrete products for the most part. And then we got into the cement business. Cement being the basis for making concrete.
Now, even though you were overseeing this company in Florida for your family, and it sold in 78, but in 66 you decide to go into politics.
Susana, you're well informed, huh? you did your homework. Well, my uncle was Maurice Ferre, and he had been part of the political scene in Puerto Rico. He had been to the Constitutional Convention, which got the Constitution of Puerto Rico, that created the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, El Estado Libre Asociado, in 1952. Ran for governor a whole bunch of times. He used to say that he was like Abraham Lincoln, that he had to run a lot before he won. Abraham Lincoln ran 7 times and lost 7 times before he became president of the United States. And so my uncle kept running and losing. But finally, in 68, he did win. But I used to go down because I wasn't sure whether I was going to live in Miami or live in Puerto Rico. So I was going back and forth, and
A very beloved governor of Puerto Rico.
And what happened was that I used to go every 4 years and help in his campaigns. So I got the political bug. Then I ran myself and served in the Florida legislature in 1967. Subsequent to that, my good friend Robert King High, who was mayor of Miami, had served for 10 years. There are 3 mayors in the history of Miami that served 10 years or more. Mayor Sewell, Mayor Robert King High, and I served 12 years.
But more than that, I think that to me, the first Latin mayor, the first Latino, the first Latin, a Puerto Rican
of a major American city was me in 1973. But interestingly enough, Susana, when I ran for mayor in 1973, the election was in November, I had 7 opponents, and I was the 8th, and I won by 50%, plus I think 30 votes or 60 votes. It was just by the skin of my teeth, but I had 7 opponents. But the Hispanic population, the registered Hispanic population was about 4%, 3 to 4% of the electorate in 1973. So I was not elected by the Hispanic community, obviously, because they were only 3 or 4% of the electorate. That changed very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely changed, which is something I want to discuss, because once you come into office, now it's 1973, you have less than 2% of the Hispanic population at all throughout all of Dade County.
No. The population was much more. We're talking about registered voters.
Registered voters.
No, by in the 1970s, remember, the Cubans started coming in 1960.
Right.
So by 1970, 12, 13 years had gone by. So the population of Miami-Dade County was about 1,200,000, 1,300,000, of which 300,000 were Hispanic. So it happened very quickly, but they weren't registered to vote. Right. Now, as they became citizens, and then they registered to vote, so that began to change in 75, 77. I had elections, but they were mild. By 1979, now my colleague and a good friend of mine, Rose Gordon, who served on the City of Miami Commission, came to me one day, she said, you've now been mayor for 6 years, and the population is changing very quickly, and if I don't run for, I want to be mayor. If I don't run for mayor now, in another 2 or 4 years, the only people that will get elected will be Hispanics, and I can't get elected, so I've got to run, and I'm going to run for mayor. So that was a tough campaign,
wow! But you won.
I won. I did.
You won.
In 1979, Rose Gordon and I ran against each other, and I did beat her. I thanks to an overwhelming vote of the Hispanic community. Now the black community, we split. Rose Gordon got 50% of the black community, and I got 50%. And the white community, she won. She was the Anglo white community.
And you ended up with the Hispanic community.
And that was enough to get me elected.
Exactly.
Now, 2 years later, in 1981, my opponent was also my friend, a sitting commissioner, Cuban American, Manolo Rebozo, and he really worked hard, spent well over $1 million, which in those days was a lot of money. And he took all the Hispanic vote, he took all the Cuban vote, and I only ended up getting 24% of the Hispanic vote in 1981.
Is that where the black vote?
Then the black vote really came out and supported me strongly, and I also won the Anglo white American vote. Yeah. And then again, it happened in '83. Same thing, except this time it wasn't Rebozo, it was Javier Suarez, and I beat him again.
Right.
So, and then in '85, finally, I had no choice but to fire the black city manager, even though I had been responsible to bringing him to the city of Miami. I was responsible for the first African American city attorney, for the first African American police chief, which was a major change. in the southern city that
Many people
Miami
don't remember
was.
this, you know,
Yeah.
which is amazing. And I love you for being on this show and reminding
Yeah.
even newcomers like me that come into Miami later
Yeah.
on to
So
understand.
there were major changes during that period of time, but Howard Gary was doing things that were not nice, and they weren't for the benefit of the city, and I had really no choice but to fire
Well,
him. And then I lost the black vote,
Yeah.
but I had to do it.
Yeah.
So Javier Suarez mounted a tough campaign, and a fellow by the name of Raul Masvidal, a Cuban American, also a good friend, a very well qualified man, a banker, a distinguished career. He decided to run in. He spent $2 million,
Wow.
and he ended up in a runoff with Javier Suarez, which he lost, and Javier Suarez won.
Now I have to tell you, the pressure that you set that in 81 you had to fire the first
yeah,
81 you said.
No. It was 80. It was 84 when
84.
Howard Gary we fired in 84. The election
84.
was in 85. And then I lost.
Okay, so in 1984, you have tremendous pressure that you're seeing as you're reviewing, and finally you come to this decision, which was obviously at a crossroads, and you finally decide it's the best for the people, and you
Right.
fire the first black
City
appointed
manager.
chief.
No, city manager.
City manager.
City, not chief, not police
Right,
chief.
city manager. But there must have been a lot of pressure during that decade because, as the Time cover says in 1981, Paradise Lost, that
Right.
must have brought a lot of pressure through your office. I mean,
Oh,
even
sure.
though, you know, Brickell Avenue, which was in the 40s becoming the homes to the wealthy Puerto Ricans, eventually Brickell ended up being sold a lot in the 70s through the 80s to build these wonderful high-rises
right.
that came from South American developments.
No. That came much later, Susana. Those were really Americans that were buying, and it was really what happened was it became a major financial center. In other words, Brickell, and of course I had a lot to do with it. That's what I would really dedicate myself to. And from the river to 15th Road, which is a mile and a half, that whole area just blossomed up with commercial buildings for the most part. There were very few residential, some hotels. There were some residential in the 15th Road area.
Yeah.
Then eventually, from 15th Road down to the Rickenbacker
That was the
Causeway,
90s, Hugo Colombo,
that
all those
developed. Yeah, well,
developments.
Hugo Colombo was my wife's house on the Santa Maria,
Right.
which my wife's father had bought in 1952.
Thank God he didn't knock the house.
No,
gate.
well, you know, actually they were going to knock down the house, but I kept in the financial things. That's a long story, but
it's there, Villa
it's-
Maria.
yeah,
You can see it.
No, not the gate. The house is there.
Too.
In other words, that house was built in 1926,
Yeah.
and it's
Well,
a
that's
beautiful
wonderful.
house, and it's still there. Yeah.
That's awesome. And so now the financial district is really booming with all these banks as well.
Yeah. Well, we started that because by the time I left office, there were 13 EDGAC banks. Now, you know how many there are? There are over 50. So Miami's really become a major financial center. And in effect, that whole Brickell Avenue area is really Wall Street South. So
Yes, it is.
It's one of
I
the
would
great,
definitely say that.
yeah. And that was important to me because there were two goals that I had when I became mayor of Miami. One was to recognize that Miami's future was in Latin America. In other words, to internationalize Miami, because Miami was really a very American, not completely southern, but it was a very
It's
southern.
a southern.
It was part of Florida, you know,
Yeah.
and it was part of.
It's the South.
It was the South. There's no question about it. And there was a big presence of New Yorkers and Midwesterners in the Bal Harbor area and other parts of Miami-Dade County. But Miami was really, was a southern city. So I thought it was important for Miami to understand that the future was in Latin America, the Caribbean and Latin America. And the other thing that was important to me was to change the economic base so that the residential part, the homeowners of Miami, didn't carry the burden of the city's taxes. So one of the things that I was able to achieve in a 12-year period was to flip the commercial taxes and the residential taxes. When I started, the homes paid 60% of the taxes. When I left, they were down to 40%. So the commercial part of Miami was paying 60%
of the taxes.
and that's what really kept Miami afloat, and for us to be able to have a first-class police department and a first-class fire department and so on.
Which I have to tell you that in that era that you're there was, as a mayor, I could only imagine the insomnia, I would assume, because every single term brought, whether it was the influx of so many Cuban refugees or refugees from Haiti, no one really, everybody who was here in Miami, there was not that strong, there was no roots. You grew up somewhere else. And so holding on to you, you know, 12 years, you became iconic. You became people's roots. You became a leader of the people. And so when you look at the influx of so many
at the right place at the right time.
You were at the right place at the right time, and some might say maybe not so. You know,
True, true. But you know, I never lost any sleep on it because my conscience, of course, was always clear, and I think we had a good team of people that were running the city, and we were, you know.
What happens when Washington, D.C., were you part when Washington, D.C. walks in and takes over?
Well, you know, what happened, of course, is that cities don't have foreign policies. That's a national, that's the federal government who does that. So what happened in Mariel was, remember, a whole bunch, thousands of Cubans went into the Peruvian embassy. They were allowed to go in, and then Fidel Castro decided to let these people go. They wanted to leave Cuba. So he said, all right, I will open the Mariel, and you in Miami, you Cubans up there, come get your families, friends, and relatives. Then what he did was, he went to the insane asylums and to the prisons, and he emptied them, and so in each boat that took 10, 15, 20 people, there was 20, 30% of those people were forced on that boat by the Cuban government. So what happened was that in a 90-day period, think of it, 90 days, we got 125,000 Cubans that came in small boats across the Straits of Florida, mostly into the Key West Marathon area. And of course, Key West was the entry gate. But those people were all brought to Miami, and then we had to house them. Where we put them? We had to build tents.
Under 95, and now the word goes out to the community that they're mostly coming from insane asylums.
No, but that wasn't so. You see, that was really a lot of propaganda. There were some that were coming.
It was a small percentage, obviously.
Well, it wasn't so small. It was 20%. 20% of a million of 120,000 is over 10,000 is over 12,000.
Yeah.
So you know, you get a couple of people that are very criminal. That are bad criminals. You get 10 bad people that go out and rob and mug and do all kinds of things, and that's exactly what they did. And
that highest crime rate in the country was Miami.
So a lot of those people, once they were apprehended, ended up going to Fort Chaffee, which is really interesting because it affected American politics. In other words, Fort Chaffee, of course, is in Arkansas. Well, who's the governor of Arkansas? A guy by the name of Bill Clinton. And so Bill Clinton gets caught in the middle of all this thing, and guess what happens to Bill Clinton? He loses the election. So he was governor for 4 years, then he got kicked out.
Right.
And then he came back and ran for re-election and won 4 years later. And then the rest is history. You know, he ended up running for president, and he was president for 8 years. Now his wife is running for the presidency. So all of this Miami story is really mixed up with what happened to Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, and what happened in Fort Chaffee, which is where a lot of these criminals were taken and housed, and they broke out. And there was a major issue. In the meantime, here in Miami, we had to assimilate all these people, and the federal government came in.
You had to find schooling. You had all these 23,000 refugee kids, I think, in 1 year.
Right. But they didn't all stay here, you know, because the federal government figured out a way in which they would take, a lot of these people went up to the central United States and the Midwest, and a lot of small towns that took 2 or 3 or 4 or 10. Now, what happened is, as those people learned English and they went to school and they all came to Miami. So I guarantee you, all 125,000, most of them left Miami, but they all came back. And so that really helped to build a major economic, because like all unbelievable, people don't understand this, and a lot of people still don't believe it, but those immigrants are hardworking people.
Absolutely.
And they bring strength to a community, and that's exactly what happened in Miami. So a lot of the growth that we had, unbelievably, was due to this injection of 125,000 people into this Miami community. That, we got the Scarface picture out of it, but we got a lot more.
We got a lot more, and I definitely agree with that. Now, like I was saying, last week I had the controversial guest, Mickey Monday, who happened to have been part of that whole, bringing in, like, Florida through the straits and through the waters, all from immigrants.
I thought he was a pilot, wasn't he? A pilot?
He had the boats and he had the planes. He had both.
Yeah.
And he had the watch houses in Bal Harbor with all the watch people and all, called it the entry port, or the, through the door 1, door 2. And it was a master plot and plan that obviously, as you say, on one hand, in the political seat, Miami is definitely the home for seeing the growth of South America. It's the closest thing to the North Americas. But wherever opportunity knocks, exploitation answers sometimes.
Well, Susana, there's an interesting thing about that. First of all, with all due respect to this gentleman, Mickey, whatever his last name is, he was a minor player. I mean, the big players were the Colombians. Mm-hmm. And, of course, now they used Americans, and there were a whole bunch of them that were importers and traffickers and what have you. But the big push and these guys were all these organized gangs
from Colombia,
in Cali and in Medellin, and these are big tough guys.
That's a real mafia. That's the real people.
They were real criminals. So they came in here. But here's what happens. Here's what happened. And people get very upset when I say this, but it's the truth. What happens is, what came with that was money laundering. Because if you come in and you bring all these suitcases and bags and big bales of cocaine, money, and you sell it and you get cash, what do you do with that? See? So what happened was that was all
deposit,
washed, and it ends up in a bank. Well, you know what? When you get a $20 bill in packages or suitcases full that come in, and it goes into the coffers and becomes part of the Federal Reserve system, the system doesn't recognize that that's cocaine money. And so what happened was, Miami was awash in money. And so all these banks had these tremendous sums of money to lend. And who did they lend the money to? Well, the best place to lend money like that is to developers.
Right.
So in other words, I don't think that as that money was washed, laundered, it became the basis for a tremendous economic growth in Miami, unfortunately, because it was really tainted, dirty money. But once it got washed and got into the
it came into our economy, and that's where you get so many banks and so many car dealerships, and you get so much going on.
Absolutely.
And we're going to continue right back after these commercials. Susana Baker and Art Talk with Maurice Ferre. We'll be right back after commercial breaks.